This is section 239 of Mark Twain, The Complete Interviews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview number 239, Frederick Boyd Stevenson, Mark Twain on the Scope of the Children's Theater. Brooklyn Eagle News Special, November 24, 1907, page 1. Read by John Greenman. When I saw the performance of those children, and heard the perfect rendition of the parts assigned to them, began Mark Twain, one thing came uppermost in my mind. That was their perfect enunciation. He shifted his position a little in the big Venetian bed, where he receives some of his visitors and does much of his writing, took a good pull at his pipe, and blew a cloud of smoke ceilingward. Of his book, The Prince and the Pauper, had been presented at the Children's Theater of the Educational Alliance, where he had been the host to a fashionable audience. Now, if there is one particular thing which Americans should learn to do, he went on, it is to speak their native language correctly. We have certain acquaintances who visit us occasionally, and whom we in turn visit, as you and other people have, no doubt. One of these persons, whom I have in mind, pronounces his words so indistinctly that I can hardly understand him, although he may not be sitting farther from me than you. That one defect destroys all the pleasure of his visit. But he is not the only offender. The blurring of our words, the curtailing of our syllables, and running them into other syllables of other words, is one of the most disagreeable characteristics of the American method of speech. And it is not a characteristic that belongs alone to the uneducated. It is quite common. Yes, I think I may say it is common with the educated classes. One thing is certain. Incorrect enunciation is a great bar to the true enjoyment of conversation. Why, the man who cannot talk correctly, the man who cannot talk correctly. He raised himself from his pillows, took his pipe from his mouth, waved his hands threateningly above his head, and ejaculated fiercely, "He ought not talk at all." A little tiger-striped kitten that came from Tuxedo took a quick run across the room, and with one agile jump was on the big bed. Mark Twain stroked its soft fur caressingly. The fierceness had gone from his voice as he continued, "And now it seems that we Americans may learn how to speak the English language from the East Side, nearly all of whose citizens came to this country unable to speak the tongue of which they so soon become master. This fine enunciation of many of the young people of the East Side is due to the work of the Educational Alliance, and a great part of it is brought about by the training received at the Children's Theater, under the auspices of that organization. The work of this institution is one of the most remarkable educational developments in the country. Its influence is already spread throughout the Lower East Side. I believe it will spread to all parts of the country and be universally adopted as an educational factor. President Eliot of Harvard, who was there last night, as you know, I said, told me that he had witnessed with a great deal of pleasure a dramatic performance in Cambridge where the poet Longfellow's granddaughter took the part of Shylock. He said he believed that such instruction was of inestimable educative benefit, and that the same methods ought to be introduced in every public school in the United States. "President Eliot is entirely right," said Mr. Clemens. "In this method of instruction you have the first incentive for obtaining knowledge, that is, personal interest. With that comes concentration and ambition to excel. It is not the theatrical idea that is aimed at. In fact, as Miss Hertz, the manager of the theater, says, the idea of the theater as a profession is discouraged rather than encouraged. The scope of the movement is to interest these young people of the East Side in wholesome and classic dramas, to instill in them a love for good literature and a knowledge of the true motives of life. There is a great deal of the dramatic in the make-up of every human being. By the dramatic we can appeal to one's sympathies, to one's highest sentiments, to one's sense of justice and right, and to one's ambition to progress. Not only are the mental attributes quickened by this method of instruction, but the aesthetic attributes are developed also. I have in mind an instance that occurred not long ago at that little theater, which illustrates this point. They were putting on a play requiring 15 or 20 characters to be represented by young girls. The costumes were plain and somber. To many of the East Side people there remains that relic of savagery, a love of gaudy colors and display in dress, and on this occasion that bit of hereditary fondness made itself apparent. Several of the mothers of the young girls who were to take part in the performance were anxious to make costumes for their daughters of striking patterns and colors that would accord more with their ideas of fine dress than the subdued garments of the play. But the manager was firm. The play must be presented on conventional lines, and this decision resulted in the formation of a more refined taste in the households that were represented at the play and in the households whose members attended the play. So it is in all lines of action and of thought. The improvement comes not only to the young people who take part in the plays, but extends to their families and friends. They rehearse their parts in the homes, and the plays become known to every one of the immediate family and acquaintances. So you see, this education is an education for all the people of the East Side. There is another point. Perhaps it is the most important of all. Yes, I am sure it is the most important, he continued slowly. A point that we should all attend to. A point that America has good reason to attend to. The strong face of my host assumed a thoughtful and serious expression. He sat erect in bed and ran his hands through his long white hair. His white robe with its turned-down collar was open at the throat. The pillows were clustered behind him against the high mahogany headboard of the bed. He spoke more earnestly than he had spoken before. "This chief point of importance," he said, "relates to citizenship." Again he paused for just an instant, then he said, quickly, sharply, "Citizenship? We have none. In place of it we teach patriotism, which Samuel Johnson said 140 or 150 years ago was the last refuge of the scoundrel, and I believe that he was right. I remember when I was a boy I heard repeated and repeated time and time again the phrase, "My country, right or wrong, my country." How absolutely absurd is such an idea! How absolutely absurd to teach this idea to the youth of the country! He was speaking calmly and deliberately, but his voice showed the indignation that he felt. "And this seems to be the sole idea of patriotism," he went on. "Not long ago I saw 15 or more boys drilling. They assumed a military air, and went through the evolutions of trained soldiers. This was to teach them patriotism, but what incentive with our ideas of patriotism is there for the young man of today to shoulder his gun and fight for his country? I can imagine one situation, even under the present state of affairs, where a man could feel that he ought to fight for his country. That situation might be an invasion. In such a case a man should fight, but he should fight under protest, and for this reason. When a country is invaded, it is because it has done some wrong to another country, some wrong like the United States did in taking the Philippines, a stain upon our flag that can never be effaced. Yet today in the public schools we teach our children to salute the flag, and this is our idea of instilling in them patriotism, and this so-called patriotism we mistake for citizenship. But if there is a stain on that flag, it ought not to be honored, even if it is our flag. The true citizenship is to protect the flag from dishonor, to make it the emblem of a nation that is known to all nations as true and honest and honorable. And we should forever forget that old phrase, "My country, right or wrong, my country." Mark Twain refilled his pipe carefully. He applied a match and pulled away vigorously till the tobacco on top was aglow. The little tiger kitten climbed upon his shoulders and walked familiarly around his neck. For a few moments Mark Twain puffed in silence. "It may be," he continued, "that we must learn our lessons of citizenship on the East Side in the Children's Theater. There the true principles of true life, which mean true citizenship, are being taught to those boys and girls who are to be the future citizens of America. First of all, they are taught self-respect and confidence. They are taught that the true motives of life are to reach for the highest ideals. The dramas that they play have morals that tend toward this aim, and, best of all, they are taught to act for themselves and to think for themselves. It is this self-thinking that goes to make up the true public opinion. We say we have public opinion in America. We have none. We only think second-hand. How many of us are there today who know whether it is better for the country to have a tariff or free trade? The only opinions most of us have on this subject are the opinions derived second-hand from certain men who seek to influence us to their way of thinking, and their way of thinking is generally in a direction that will subserve their own private ends, or the ends of the party which they represent. So you see, we have no citizenship, and our so-called patriotism is a patriotism that is employed for the benefit of political parties, and is made a party cry. Now, then, is there a new cult forming on the East Side? Are we to learn what true citizenship means and what true patriotism means from this new cult? Is this the beginning here to extend universally? For 14 years Isidor Straus, the president of the Educational Alliance, has devoted himself to educating these future citizens. The Educational Alliance greets them at the steamship landing, and from that time onward never loses track of them. Their morals are watched. They are educated in the practical things of life, the things that make for this very citizenship which we, as a nation, have lost. We have good reason to emulate these people of the East Side. They are reading our history and learning the great questions of America that we do not know and are not learning, and they are learning them firsthand and are doing their own thinking. They are not backward in studying the statistics that many of us seem to abhor because we think they are dry, yet if we only studied them the right way, statistics are intensely interesting. The fire in the grate was burning low. Mark Twain arose and tossed 3 or 4 logs upon it. The flames wrapped around the dry wood and lighted up the room. "Your life has been a busy one," I ventured. "The public owes much to you, but perhaps the most important work of your life is the work of helping this movement of the Children's Theater." "It is the most important work of my life," he said emphatically. The serious look had left him. The brightness of the flames on the logs was reflected in his face. End of interview number 239, read by John Greenman. This is section 240 of Mark Twain, The Complete Interviews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview number 240, Twain out $32,000 in Plasmon failure. New York American, December 21, 1907, pages 1 and 2. Read by John Greenman. Mark Twain is a sufferer to the extent of $32,500 by the involuntary bankruptcy which was thrust upon the Plasmon Company of America in the United States Court yesterday. Twain was acting president and vice president of the concern, an independent branch of which is flourishing in England. It manufactures milk products, and until mismanagement forced it to the wall, the American concern was doing a rushing business. Twain thought it was a good thing anyhow, and put $32,500 into it. Disregarding his former business experience, he permitted himself to be inveigled into the marts of trade once more, like the comedian who simply can't resist Hamlet. While acting president of the concern, an office which he accepted in the hope of saving it from final destruction, someone served on the humorist the preliminary papers in an action to recover more than there was in the treasury. Mark carefully put the notice in his pocket. That was his day to be literary. Next day he completely forgot the circumstance, and a few days later judgment was taken by default. That started the run on the bank. Yesterday the end came. It isn't altogether a funny story, for there is reason to believe Mr. Clemens has been deliberately swindled. He admits that he has, anyhow. His faith in the product of the company, which cured him of dyspepsia, he says,
was so strong that he was disinclined to adopt harsh measures. Somebody played on his good nature and his artistic contempt for sordid details. Anyhow, he's $32,500 out. At his home, No. 21 Fifth Avenue, last night, the humorist, whose second venture in business has thus turned out disastrously, wagged his head dolefully over the upset. A big black cat sat on the top step and yowled dismally as the reporter walked up. Miss Lyon, Mr. Clemens' secretary, saw the reporter first. While they discussed the affair, there were sounds of sardonic laughter in the room beyond. Then a pen scratched viciously over a sheet of paper. Just when the reporter had abandoned all hope of seeing the humorist, the acting president and vice president of the Plasmon Company of America strode out into the hall. He had discarded his customary suit of white flannel and wore solemn black. He shook hands after the manner of one welcoming the mourners. Pressed to tell all about it, however, Twain seemed too full for utterance. He pointed out that he mustn't talk for publication, alleging a fear that the reporter wouldn't quote his language exactly as he said it. In substance, the interview was as follows. "Your friends say that you were outrageously swindled, were you?" asked the reporter.
"I was."
"Out of how much?"
"Oh, about $32,000.
"How did it happen?"
"Well,"
and here the reader can imagine a characteristic drawl,
"I hold $25,000 worth of stock, and one of the members of the company swindled me out of $12,500 later. But I don't mean that I was swindled out of the $25,000. The company failed because of bad management."
"Who was the man that got your $12,500? Mr. Clemens here mentioned the name, with a hideous laugh, and turning to Miss Lyon, said,
"Well, I guess that will fix Mr. of
"Was this the first time that you were ever swindled?" said the reporter.
"In my life? The first time in my life?"
The humorist looked pained. He seemed to regard the question as a slight on his world-wide experience. He laughed outright.
"Why, I have been swindled out of more money than there is on this planet," he replied triumphantly. "But," he resumed with a reminiscent air, "I oughtn't to say I was swindled out of all the money. Most of it was lost through bad business. I was always bad in business."
Mr. Clemens wound up the chapter by cautioning the reporter not to confound the bankruptcy company with the English Plasmon Company.
"That is paying 5 or 6%, said he, "which is doing well for an English company. I hold $80,000 worth of stock in the English company."
Curiously enough, it was while Twain was laboring prodigiously to retrieve the losses sustained in his other business venture that he made the acquaintance of Plasmon. That was 8 years ago, when he was following the equator on his famous lecture tour. He was suffering horribly from indigestion when he met in Vienna a Professor Siebold, who had discovered Plasmon. Twain claimed to have been cured by it, and when he went to London some time later and discovered that a Plasmon company was being organized, he took stock in it. Similarly, when, after the success of the staple in England, John Hayes Hammond, the well-known engineer, and others decided to organize a Plasmon company in America, Twain again invested. Hammond's associate in the venture was a man named H. A. Butters of California. The new company was organized with a capitalization of $750,000, of which 1/3 of the issue went to the English company, 1/3 was paid-up capital, and the remaining third was to be given as bonus to the subscribers who put up the money. Twain subscribed $25,000, for which he was entitled to 50,000 shares. But as it turns out, someone manipulated the books, and he was never credited with more than the original 25,000 shares at a par of $1, and these are now valueless. The remainder of his loss was sustained through money advanced at odd times to the promoter, whose name he gave to the reporter last night. Bad management has characterized the life of the company here from the beginning. There have been constant fights in the courts. The directors have been divided. Litigation has followed litigation, until a much better businessman than Mark Twain would have found himself nonplussed to locate the exact financial standing of the concern. According to Ralph W. Ashcroft, whose claim was included in those which have reduced the concern to bankruptcy, the bad management of Butters was responsible in the first instance for the wreck of the company. Butters is now in California. Ashcroft also places considerable blame on Harold Wheeler, who succeeded Butters as manager of the company. John Hayes Hammond tried to make something out of it, and he, too, failed. It seemed to be the fate of the concern, perhaps because of the blighting influence of Twain, never to prosper, and finally, after its counsels had been divided for more than a year, Hammond, a year ago, gave up in disgust and turned it over to Twain and Ashcroft. End of interview number 240, read by John Greenman. This is section 241 of Mark Twain, The Complete Interviews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview number 241, Rival Jokesmiths Off for Bermuda, New York World, February 23, 1908, page 3, read by John Greenman. Mark Twain and his friend H. H. Rogers sailed on the Bermudian yesterday for Bermuda. Years ago, Mark Twain warned "my young friend Harry Rogers to mend his ways, or he would come to some bad end." "I see we're discovered," said Mark Twain when the reporters appeared. "That's what I get for being in bad company." "You've got no edge on me," returned the Standard Oil's chief jester. "Some of my methods may be bad, the public says so, at least, but they're no worse than your jokes, Sam." "Listen," said Mr. Twain, "I'll sell you a joke for $1, and Rogers will sell you financial information for another $1. I keep my jokes to sell, just as he keeps his knowledge on finance to sell." "I'm going because Mark is paying my fare," said Mr. Rogers. "I'm broke again." "Yes, I'm paying his fare, but I'm $2 shy," said the other. "I'm going to shake him down for that $2 when we get out to sea." "That's one of his jokes," returned Mr. Rogers, "but it isn't worth $2, is it?" "My picture? I'll pose, but only on a condition that Twain will promise not to pick the photographer's pocket when the cloth is over his head." "I'm rather particular about who poses with me," drawled Mark Twain between puffs at his cigar. "Of course, it will be a step down to pose with Rogers, but I suppose I'll have to take a couple of steps down like that before I die. Rogers usually has his picture taken up in Mulberry Street, but, well, I'll submit. That kind of financiering is too high for me," said the author. "I'm as near to you as I want to stand," remarked Mr. Rogers. "I'm really going along to keep Rogers straight," said Mr. Twain in a stage whisper. Wheeling and surveying the cloudless horizon, Mr. Rogers said the financial outlook didn't differ very much from that. "The horizon is bright," he added, looking far away. End of interview number 241, read by John Greenman. This is section 242 of Mark Twain, The Complete Interviews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview number 242. Mark Twain faced two perils. New York American, April 14, 1908, page 3. Read by John Greenman. After an escape from being washed overboard while gallantly showing a young lady how a log works at the taffrail of the Quebec steamship Bermudian, Mark Twain, with his friend H. H. Rogers, arrived from Bermuda yesterday. Both men were looking extremely well, and while the former did not go away exactly for his health, Mr. Rogers was willing to admit that his own had been improved. Mrs. Rogers accompanied her husband on the homeward voyage. Miss Dorothy Sturgis of Boston is the young woman who had the honor of being drenched with the world-famous humorist. She is a granddaughter of Russell Sturgis. It was on Sunday. The ship was pitching heavily. Mr. Clemens and Miss Sturgis were watching the revolving of the little wheel that tells how fast the ship is going. Suddenly, and without warning, a huge wave came up from behind the ship, and the two were engulfed in it. The young lady was lightly dressed, and Mark Twain had on his famous white suit. When the water receded, and they could be seen again, they looked as if they had been in swimming. The humorist, in speaking of the incident yesterday, said, "Miss Sturgis, being from Boston, is always in the swim, but at my time of life I have lost interest in surprise parties. I prefer something more formal than a slap in the back, even from my old friend Neptune." Continuing, Mr. Clemens said, "My other old friend, Rogers, has improved very much as a result of our trip. He is not any heavier, but he takes more interest in life and is rather steadier on his feet than when he went away. Financially he is just as bad as ever. I had to help him out repeatedly. At one time I was so careless as to offer to lend him $2. He did not take me up, so I am in $2, but it was a terrible risk. Yes, it is true I have joined the Anti-Noise Society, having made all the noise I could, and getting tired of it. I have decided that nobody else is to make any at all hereafter. I have given up the lecture platform and banquets, and now everybody else has got to be still. Mrs. Rice came to me just at the proper moment. The Anti-Noise Society is an excellent thing. I am going to be quiet hereafter, and so must everybody else." Mr. Clemens was asked about the plan of digging a deep-water channel through the length of the Mississippi, and he declared that he was unalterably against it. "I would rather follow things that are reasonably substantial than this will-o'-the-wisp," he said. "In the first place, if the channel were dug, it would never be maintained, and to dig it 14 feet deep would require all the money in 14 banks in England, and then it would not last. I see that they have invited the President to view the project, which is very much wiser for them to do than to invite the Mississippi pilots to see it." Mr. Clemens said he would remain at his Fifth Avenue house for 5 weeks, and would then repair to the new home he is building on a farm at Redding, Connecticut, 4 miles from Danbury. He had written nothing, he said, during his stay in Bermuda, but would resume work when settled in the country. End of interview number 242, read by John Greenman. This is section 243 of Mark Twain, The Complete Interviews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview number 243, Mark Twain Meets the Cardinal, New York American, May 10, 1908,
page 1W. Read by John Greenman. After the parade was over and the stand was about deserted, Mark Twain and his secretary, Miss Lyons, started away together. The humorist politely inquired of a lieutenant the way out, but the latter merely pointed his finger at the street. A second later, upon being told who the white-haired gentleman was, the officer hurried after him and made amends by escorting Mr. Twain to Broadway. "Yes," drawled Mr. Clemens as he climbed in his cab, "it was a fine parade. I always liked the police, but I suppose that was because they always seemed to take such a great interest in me and what I was doing. Did I meet the Cardinal? Oh, yes, I met His Eminence, and found him a very nice old gentleman. He told me he had read my books. He didn't say with approval, I must admit, but he looked like an intelligent man, and one who approved of high-class literature, so I took it for granted that he read my books with approval." End of interview number 243, read by John Greenman. This is section 244 of Mark Twain, The Complete Interviews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview number 244. Mark Twain cannot bubble humor, he says, as demanded. New York American, September 8, 1908, page 3. Read by John Greenman. Samuel L. Clemens, Mark Twain, who has deserted New York, has moved into his new 19-room house 1 mile from Reading Center in Connecticut. Speaking yesterday to an American reporter, he said, "I came to Reading because I became too tired to stay in New York. When I first came up here and had a glimpse of the Berkshire range in the distance, I was charmed. It all seemed so restful. It was what you might call a feeding view, for every time you look away across the hills and vales you see some new point of interest to feed upon and enjoy. I am not going to vegetate, because to vegetate means to rust, and I don't intend to treat myself in any such rusty fashion. You see, in New York, where I had to attend social functions and dinners, I generally had to speak. Now, when a humorist rises to speak, he is expected to simply bubble humor, and there are times when one does not feel the bubbling process as strongly as at others. I felt that I needed rest, and here I am going to get it. We shall have small week-end parties here, and I shall be glad to see my friends." Mark Twain had not even heard yesterday of the reported engagement of his daughter, Miss Clara Clemens, to Charles Wark of this city. Miss Lyons, the novelist's private secretary, denied the report. Miss Clemens, she said, had no thought of marriage. Instead, it is possible that she may become a grand opera star. Her voice is a contralto of great power, and has gained much praise in her concert tour in Europe. End of interview number 244, read by John Greenman. This is section 245 of Mark Twain, The Complete Interviews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview number 245, Burglar Chase at Mark Twain's Ends in Shooting. New York World, September 19, 1908, page 3. Read by John Greenman. Mark Twain's notice to his next burglar. "There is nothing to be had in this house henceforth but plated ware. You will find it in that brass thing over in the corner by the basket of kittens. If you want the basket, put the kittens in the brass thing, and do not make a noise. It disturbs the family. You will find gum-shoes in the front hall by that thing that has umbrellas in it, the thing they call a chiffonnier or pergola or whatever it is. Please close the door when you go away. Affectionately, S.L.C. The above is the notice that Mark Twain, Samuel L. Clemens, wrote yesterday and hung up in the dining room of his beautiful country home in the hills near Redding, Connecticut. The reason for the notice was potent. For burglars, bold, bad burglars, who are now languishing in the jail at Bridgeport, invaded the Clemens home early yesterday morning and stole $300 worth of real silverware and some considerable amount of near silverware. The latter they disdained and threw away, the plated stuff, and the real silver they kept and had taken away from them when Sheriff George Banks of Fairfield County and H.A. Lounsbury of Redding, a neighbor of Twain's, fell on the pair in a New York, New Haven, and Hartford train at Bethel, and beat them up. They also arrested them. Mark Twain thinks that if he had had the thumbprints that Pudd'nhead Wilson discovered, the capture and identification of the burglarious couple might have been quick and more complete. But the sheriff and Mr. Lounsbury, who started on the trail as soon as Miss Lyon, Mark Twain's secretary, and Miss Clara, the daughter of the famous humorist, gave the alarm, had something equally as good to aid them. One of the burglars wore rubber heels. His track in the dust was distinct. They trailed the rubber heels and captured the two robbers. The sheriff was shot in the leg by one of them, and the burglar was hit on the head with a club. Incidentally, the battered burglar shot 4 or 5 holes in the roof of the New Haven car in which the fight took place. Mark Twain was quite delighted with the burglary. He was in rare good humor last night when he talked to a World reporter. First, he insisted, as is his wont, that he positively must not be quoted, that he would not have any quotation marks used in reporting him, and then he settled back in the chair in the handsome big library of his residence and puffed contentedly on a black cigar before starting to relate the story. He was attired in a white linen suit and a white tie and white shirt, suggesting, somehow, a new schooner with all sails set. Mark Twain said he was very, very glad to receive burglars, that he had always found them to be most amiable people, and that he had had so much experience with them in his lifetime that he had come to like them greatly. "And father didn't get downstairs until ages after it was all over," said Miss Clemens, "and then he came sauntering down at 2 o'clock in the morning, mind you, in a bathrobe, smoking a pipe and asking what all the commotion was about. And then he said that it was silly to get scared about burglars, and that he wished they'd be more quiet about it and not wake people up. He said that he heard the pistol shots, Claude, the butler, shot several times at the men, but father said that he didn't know what the sounds were, and didn't care." Mr. Clemens broke in at this juncture to say that the sounds reminded him of popping corks, and that he had a vague desire to join the party, but that he remembered that he had a bottle of Scotch in his room, and that it would therefore be very foolish to go downstairs to get a drink. And champagne didn't appeal to him much anyhow. He said that if future robbers would just do as he suggests in his notice, they won't trouble anybody in the house, and while they'll get no profit, they'll suffer no losses. He added that he had never met a burglar that bothered him, especially if the burglar was thoughtful enough to leave the premises 3 or 4 hours before he, Twain, knew he was around. Then Mark Twain, shaking his snow-capped dome, sagely stated that if he were to wake up and find a burglar in his room, he'd invite him to have a drink, make himself at home, and that he would tell Mr. Burglar to take what he wanted and go away and let other folks sleep. Why fuss with a burglar, was a suggestion. Why quarrel with him or annoy him? He said that the young folks around the house had got all worked up about burglars, But that was because they hadn't had his experience with them. Down at the City Hall in Reading, when the two thieves, who gave their names as Huffanen and Williamson, were arraigned before Judge Nickerson of Fairfield County, and bound over to the grand jury, Mark Twain was on hand. He was just as unperturbed as usual, and drawled in the same old way when he lectured the yeggs criminals. "You are a disgrace to your race," said he, "and you ought to be ashamed of yourselves. I have been at the front as a defender of the Jewish people all my life. I have written defenses of you, and have contended that Jews have never, as a rule, been guilty of big crimes, crimes of violence. The Jews, as a people, are law-abiding, and seldom do anything such as you have done." The Twain country home is splendidly isolated. It is half a mile from the nearest neighbor, Mr. Lounsbury, and is surrounded by forest and flowered field. There are goldenrod and smilax, and beds of asters and tangles of berry bushes about it. It was this place that the two robbers entered. It was past midnight when Miss Lyon, Mr. Clemens' secretary, heard a noise downstairs. She said that it sounded as though someone had stumbled. Miss Clara Clemens heard it also. Miss Lyon rushed boldly downstairs. In the dining-room she found confusion. A heavy mahogany table, in which $300 worth of silver was kept, was gone. A small taboret was upset. Some liqueur glasses were broken. The door was open. Miss Lyon rushed to the telephone and called up Mr. Lounsbury. "Burglars have been here and stolen the furniture," she wailed. "And when I heard her say that, I thought she'd gone mad," observed Miss Clara in relating it. Claude Bouchot, the French butler, heard the racket and rushed downstairs with a revolver in his hand. The butler shot 4 or 5 holes in the yielding fog of Reading Hills, and it was these shots that reminded Mark Twain of popping corks. The burglars had broken in by prying open a kitchen window. Then they took the dining-room table out into the night. They put the good silver in the bag subsequently recovered by Sheriff Banks and neighbor Lounsbury. They broke one spoon in 2 to see if it was the real thing. The plated ware they evidently threw away, because none of it was recovered. As soon as Mr. Lounsbury got word over the telephone from Miss Lyon, he started for the Clemens home. Sheriff Banks was notified by phone also, and he arrived there within half an hour with his son Will. Assisted by Claude the butler, the sheriff and his son and Mr. Lounsbury started on the trail. They soon found it. One of the burglars wore rubber heels. They were easily trailed, and the clue led to Reading, and from there to Bethel. At 6 o'clock Mr. Lounsbury telephoned to the Clemens home that he was still on the job. Half an hour later he telephoned that he had met the enemy and that they were his'n. Sheriff Banks stopped at Reading when the sleuthing party arrived there. Lounsbury went on to Bethel. At the latter place 2 men boarded the train. They carried a satchel, were covered with dust, and seemed to be somewhat winded. The conductor of the train was consulted. He didn't know them. Then Lounsbury asked one of them who he was. "Haven't I met you somewhere?" was the query. The stranger replied in the negative, and rather abruptly at that. He was in no communicative mood. Mr. Lounsbury saw that he wore rubber heels. When the train stopped at Reading, Sheriff Banks boarded it. As he came up to the seat which Lounsbury occupied, the latter said, "Here are the men we want." As he did so, one of the yeggs bolted for the door and jumped off. The train was running rapidly by that time. The other burglar pulled a revolver, but Banks landed on him first. A general fight resulted, and Lounsbury, Banks, 2 brakemen, several passengers, a telegraph operator named Andy, George Brunson, a section hand, and a few others mixed it up in the aisle while the conductor stopped the train. The sheriff was on top of the burglar, and the rest of the crowd was on top of the sheriff, as nearly as can be ascertained. The burglar managed to get out a revolver, and, twisting his arm up, shot 5 times. 4 of the bullets hit the sides and ceiling of the car. The 5th one hit the sheriff in the right leg and inflicted an ugly wound. A brakeman procured one of the sticks used to turn the car ventilators and hit the burglar across the head with it, laying his scalp open for 4 inches and putting him completely out of business. Then Lounsbury, the brakeman, the operator, and the section man started after the yeggman who had escaped from the train. They caught him a short distance away, he having injured himself when he jumped. Both of the men were taken back to Reading, while the sheriff was removed to his house and a physician summoned. The wound in his thigh is a serious one, but unless blood poisoning sets in, he will recover. The prisoners were subsequently arraigned before the local justice, and it was during the hearing that Mark Twain delivered them the lecture. The men were then removed to Bridgeport. It is believed that they are New York crooks, although they gave their residence as South Norwalk. Neither one is known there. One of the local police said that the smaller of the 2 men was Red Rooney, a noted crook. This has not been corroborated. Neither of the men would talk. "Father says that he is glad the men didn't take the kittens," said Miss Clemens. "He says that he would rather lose all the silverware in the house than those kittens." And she proudly displayed a half-dozen fluffy little balls of fur that aren't more than 2 weeks old, and that are the pride of the Clemens household. "And they were right in the dining-room where the burglars were," she said. It is a matter of record that after Mark Twain had sauntered down to hear what the fuss in his house was about, and after he had finished a pipeful of tobacco, he promptly went back to bed and allowed the rest of the family to sit up and await returns from the burglars. End of interview number 245, read by John Greenman. This is section 246 of Mark Twain, The Complete Interviews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview number 246, Charles Henry Meltzer. Twain says he told her book a mistake. New York American, September 27, 1908, Section 2, page 1, read by John Greenman. When I placed a copy of the pamphlet in the hands of Mark Twain, he accepted it in the philosophic attitude so characteristic of the man, and began to read it and make his comments as the reading progressed. He then dictated the following statement to me for publication in the American. "This is not an important matter. I can say in 2 minutes all it is worth while to say about it. Let me dictate it to you, and you write it down. Proceed. I am not well pleased with her conduct in publishing, in a printed pamphlet, as charged by you, a private conversation which I had with her. Also, for making me talk in the first person when she could not by any possibility reproduce the words I used, since she did not take me down in shorthand. She put into my mouth humiliatingly weak language, whereas I used exceedingly strong language, much too strong for print, and also much too indelicate for print, a fact which she has fully recognized by not reproducing any of it. Inadequate as was her report of my sermon, she got at a good part of the substance of it, but she left out its only worth-while feature, which was the argument I offered that her book was a mistake, since, while it uttered a very large truth, it was a sort of truth which the world, for wise reasons, lets on to be unaware of, and does not talk publicly about, a sort of truth which is best suppressed, because it is not a wholesome one, and its discussion is much more likely to do harm than good. I think Mrs. Glynn originated the idea of getting you to publish that private conversation. It has the look of it. I think she gave you that typewritten report of it. It looks like the very one she showed to me the time I told her it was a quite extraordinary piece of misreporting, and much below her literary capabilities. I am afraid she wants another advertisement of her book. I am sorry, for it is a very harmful and very readable book, though I did not pay it the extravagant compliments which she has put into my mouth. There, I think of nothing further to say, and it is just as well, for your space is valuable, and so is my time. End of interview number 246, read by John Greenman. This is section 247 of Mark Twain, The Complete Interviews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview number 247, owner of Virginian, in excellent health. Norfolk, Virginia, Ledger-Dispatch, April 2, 1909, page 1. Henry H. Rogers and his party, who came down from New York on the old Dominion Line steamer Jefferson to attend the celebration of the opening of the Virginian Railway, debarked on the pier here about 10 o'clock. According to prearrangement with Mr. Dupuy, a reporter of the Ledger-Dispatch met the Rogers party upon their arrival at the hotel, and gained audience with Mr. Rogers and Mark Twain, whom Mr. Rogers said should be given his proper name and title, which is, Rogers said, Dr. Samuel L. Clemens. One of the most gratifying things observed during the sorting out and stowing away of something like a couple carloads of luggage which the visitors brought along was the fact that both Messrs. Rogers and Clemens, notwithstanding each is well along in years, and the latter confessed a couple of years ago to having then rounded Pier 70, appeared to be in as good health as ever in their lives. Hardly a more democratic man than Mr. Rogers is, may be imagined. He laughed when he said that the newspaper men should be particular about addressing his close friend, Mark Twain, as Dr. Clemens, and there seemed to be some joke in connection with this, which was not explained. Mark, being a mine, was next worked. "Mr. Twain, I beg your pardon, Dr. Clemens, will you say a few words for publication in the Ledger-Dispatch? But before you begin, will you kindly mention what your price per word is? I have heard that it is 30 cents, but want to be sure about it before ordering," said the newspaper man in an unbroken stream of words. Then he was informed that his newspaper wants only the highest class of literary word, and has heard of some writers who lately have charged $1 a word. "I have raised my price," the only one said, "and am as high as the highest of them now." Here Mr. Rogers observed, "They call you Mark Twain, Incorporated," apparently alluding to an editorial which recently appeared in this newspaper. "Yes," said Mr. Clemens, "the newspapers may treat that matter humorously, but it is no laughing matter. Do you know that I have received a letter from the German government about that, and my incorporation of myself is probably going to break the present international copyright system all to smash." Next, Mr. Clemens, who it is known by some was a pilot on the Mississippi River a little earlier in the game of life, and knows all about the bars and snags and other nightmares of navigators, was asked whether he is going to pilot the river steamer Nanticoke from Franklin, Virginia, to Venezuela, which steamer was said in a recent press report to have been sold to one who perhaps is an agent of former President of Venezuela Castro. "What does the job pay?" he inquired. "It is altogether a question of how much there is in it, and the security." With this evasive answer, Mark ported his linguistic helm and sheered off. End of interview number 247, read by John Greenman. This is section number 248 of Mark Twain, The Complete Interviews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview number 248. Mark Twain delighted the little ones. Norfolk, Virginia Ledger Dispatch, April 5, 1909, section 1, page 13. Read by John Greenman. Dr. Samuel L. Clemens heard a considerable number of younger children somewhat haltingly, but nevertheless delightfully, repeat today a certain story written by one whom they have been taught to look upon as illustrious. The story is the story of Joan of Arc, by Mark Twain, and the telling of it to Dr. Clemens was held by the Norfolk women interested in the kindergarten. The ladies were at the Lynnhaven Hotel, preparing to transport Dr. Clemens to the kindergarten in a Rambler bubble which he had just blown, when Superintendent of Public Schools R. A. Doby and School Committeeman H. B. Bagnall called at the hotel to ask Mark to address the high school scholars. They found that the kindergartners had him booked, but proposed to let the high school scholars have him after the kindergarten visit, which was imminent, was over. They therefore took Messrs. Doby and Bagnall into partnership, and all bundled into the auto with Mark and Secretary of Mark Twain, Incorporated, Ralph Ashcroft, and set off on the expedition. Dr. Clemens, who declined to go out on the inspection tour of the Virginian Railway with his friend H. H. Rogers and party yesterday, but decided to return with Mr. Ashcroft to New York tonight aboard the Old Dominion liner Hamilton, spent several hours yesterday watching the Sunday school children and the churchgoers traversing Freemason Street. His triumphant progress about Norfolk yesterday, during which he was introduced to many folks here, was attended by many diverting incidents, and his brilliant wit flashed at brief intervals. When he returned to the Lynnhaven after his walk to say good-bye to Mr. Rogers, Mr. Rogers saw him pick up his overcoat and immediately charged him with attempting to make off with another man's coat. Mark protested that the coat was his, as it really was, but Mr. Rogers said that he knew Mark's coat and also his other one, and that this was neither. This badinage, which was much enjoyed by everybody in the neighborhood, did not end until Mr. Rogers bade Mark an affectionate farewell, inquiring first, however, his plans, and ascertaining that Mr. Ashcroft was to remain with him and look after his comfort. "You are going straight to New York, are you?" asked Mr. Rogers. "You are going right to my house, aren't you?" "No," said Mark. "I have an engagement which I must fill, and then I shall go right on to Redding," Connecticut, where he has his home. Also is the place where he put out the famous notice to burglars, asking them to take what they wanted, without waking him. During the chaffing between him and Mr. Rogers yesterday, Mark asked his friend to speak to Manager Johnston of the hotel, and assure him that Mark was a nice man and probably would pay his hotel bill some time. "Where is the manager?" inquired Mr. Rogers. "He is hiding behind a screen," said Mark. The manager does not seem today to be apprehensive over his bill. Indeed, he has placed a big automobile at the service of his famous guest. A visitor who was received at the Lynnhaven today, and whose call was highly appreciated by Dr. Clemens, is Evelyn Harris, son of the late Joel Chandler Harris, Uncle Remus, whose close friend and admirer Dr. Clemens is. There has been a stream of callers today. It is suspected that he will have something of an ovation at the Old Dominion pier when he sails tonight. Dr. Clemens' absolute disregard for conventionality was never better shown than yesterday. With his private secretary he had been taking a stroll along Freemason Street, the street of the churches in Norfolk, and happened to pass the Freemason Baptist Church just as services had been concluded. Dr. Livius Langford, one of the deacons of the church, was one of the first to spy the eminent humorist, and he promptly introduced himself, concluding the introduction with an invitation to dinner. Mr. Clemens as promptly accepted. "But, Dr. Clemens," protested his secretary, "you have an engagement at 4:30 this afternoon." "Guess I am man enough to break it," said Mark Twain. End of interview number 248, read by John Greenman. This is section 249 of Mark Twain, The Complete Interviews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview number 249, Mark Twain, Rockefeller, and Others Pay Tribute to the Dead. Boston Herald, May 20th, 1909, page 1, read by John Greenman. New York, May 19th. Conspicuous among those who arrived early at the home of Henry H. Rogers after the death today was Samuel L. Clemens, Mark Twain, for many years one of the most intimate friends of Mr. Rogers. Mr. Clemens left his country place near Redding, Connecticut, this morning, intending to visit the Rogers home, only to be confronted with the sad news of his old friend's death when he arrived at the Grand Central Station. Mr. Clemens was too moved to fully express his feelings. "It is terrible, terrible," he said. "I am inexpressibly shocked. It is too much of a shock for me to be able to say anything now. I cannot talk about it. Mr. Rogers was my dearest and closest friend for years, and I only heard of his death a few minutes ago when I got off the train at the Grand Central. He was a great man." Tears were streaming down Mr. Clemens' face at the time. "But it is too much for me to say anything. The shock has been too great for me to think of anything to say befitting so great a man as Mr. Rogers. I can't talk any more. Mr. Rogers was as close to me as a brother." End of interview number 249, read by John Greenman. This is section 250 of Mark Twain, The Complete Interviews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview number 250, Mark Twain's High Esteem for Dr. Hale, Baltimore News, June 10, 1909, page 4, read by John Greenman. Mark Twain, Samuel L. Clemens, was standing this morning on the broad lawn near a clump of shady old trees at St. Timothy's School, Catonsville, when the news was brought to him of the death of his old friend, Reverend Edward Everett Hale. "I had the greatest esteem and respect for Edward Everett Hale, and the greatest admiration for his work. I am as grieved to hear of his death as I can ever be to hear of the death of my friends, though my grief is always tempered with the satisfaction of knowing that for them the hard, bitter struggle of life is ended." End of interview number 250, read by John Greenman. This is section 251 of Mark Twain, The Complete Interviews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview number 251, Twain Puts Blame on the Typesetter. Baltimore News, June 10, 1909, page 14. Read by John Greenman. Protesting his innocence of all guile, his love of pretty girls and Baltimore spring chicken, his horror of dirty streets, and his admiration of Providence, Mark Twain, whose name is given in Redding, Connecticut, city directory and on the church calendar as Samuel L. Clemens, gazed out of a window at the Belvedere this morning and awaited orders. Mark, as he is known at the Arundel and Journalists' Clubs, had an appointment at Catonsville, and he was waiting for the signal to take up his hat and his reputation and go there to say funny things to a group of young folks who had done nothing more serious than to graduate from St. Timothy's School. The great American humorist arrived in Baltimore yesterday evening, but refrained from any public function except a share in the barber shop patronized by the common herd. One of the first themes that occupied his attention was the charge that has been spread broadcast that he pilfered for Is Shakespeare Dead? A chapter from another distinguished gentleman's book. Mark made an extensive explanation of this. The sum and substance of his defense is that the whole thing was a regrettable mistake, and that the publishers of the other fellow's book are now trying to make capital out of the matter at Mark's expense. Referring to the stories of plagiarism, Mr. Clemens made the following statement: "In this, the first statement which I personally have given to the press, I wish to say that in writing my book I took the liberty of using large extracts from Mr. Greenwood's book, The Shakespeare Problem Restated. I made use of the extracts because of the great admiration which I have for that book, and with the full permission of the publishers. I added a footnote in which I gave full credit to both author and publishers. The book was put through the press in great haste, and somewhere, nobody seems to know where, the footnote was lost, probably in the composing room. That is the sum and substance of the whole story. But of course the John Lane Publishing Company of England, the publishers of Mr. Greenwood's book, are good advertisers, and have only one object in life, and that is to make money. Now, one of Mark Twain's books, so they tell me, is considered worthwhile reading. I know, at any rate, that my books have always sold well, but to have a man like Mark Twain steal portions from another man's book makes that book something extraordinary. Messrs. Lane are well aware of this fact, and it is to be regretted that a mistake in the mechanical department of another publishing house should be made much of to accuse falsely one who has already won fame in the literary world, and to put in a false light another who is the most modest and retiring of men." The humorist had been real serious for 5 minutes, and it was natural he should pine for a lighter vein. "Let's talk about something pleasant," said he. "Baltimore? Oh, I like Baltimore, always have. One of the most interesting things I know about Baltimore is in regard to spring chickens. You may not believe it, but it is a fact that you can't get real spring chickens like you get in Baltimore anywhere else in the world. You could put a fresh spring pullet in a basket, and a Baltimore cook also, put the basket in a box and nail the lid down, and take them both to New York, and let the same cook do the chicken nice and brown in the metropolis, but I declare the chicken wouldn't taste the same by any means in New York. I don't know why it is, but if you don't believe it, well, you just try it. What a lot of weather you are having in Baltimore. I never saw anything like it. I don't mind a little bit of rain, but I certainly do not want to run the risk of another Johnstown flood. But there is a Providence over all things, they say, and I suppose the rain has been sent to accomplish one good purpose in Baltimore, for of all the places I have seen, I can't recall where I ever saw so much mud and dirt in the streets. If we could only have another week of heavy rains, like the last week, I am sure that Providence would accomplish what the street department cannot. Mr. Clemens said he likes the ladies very much, especially the young ladies. "That is why I am going to the commencement this morning at St. Timothy's," he added. "They are all very sweet, and make one feel young again to be with them. Not that I am old, of course, or even think of getting old. No, indeed, I am just as young now as I was 40 years ago. Why, I don't see any reason why I shouldn't live another 100 years. There's nothing funny about that. You know, Methuselah lived for 999 years. Scripture doesn't record that he lived a better life than the rest of mortals. We never know what is in store for us." Mr. Clemens was the star figure at St. Timothy's School, where the commencement exercises were held this morning. Accompanied by A. B. Paine, Mr. Clemens arrived at the Catonsville School about 10 o'clock, and was one of the speakers. With his eyes a twinkle and a smile playing about his face, Mr. Clemens, with his peculiar drawl, gave the girls some advice. "There is nothing for me to do but to tell you young ladies what not to do. There are 3 things that you should never do on any occasion. First, don't smoke. That is, not to excess. I am 73 and have always smoked during my 73 years to excess. Second, don't drink. That is, to excess. Third, don't marry. That is, to excess. Now, if you young ladies refrain from all these things, you will have all the virtues that anyone will honor and respect. Another thing I want to say, and that is that honesty is the best policy. I remember when I had just written Innocents Abroad, when I and my partner wanted to start a newspaper syndicate, we needed $3 and did not know where to get it. While we were in a quandary, I espied a valuable dog on the street. I picked up the canine and sold him to a man for $3. Afterwards, the owner of the dog came along, and I got $3 from him for telling him where the dog was. So I went back and gave the $3 to the man whom I sold it to, and I have lived honestly ever since." Mr. Clemens was received with great enthusiasm. End of interview number 251, read by John Greenman. This is section 252 of Mark Twain, The Complete Interviews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview number 252, Mark Twain, Their Guest. Baltimore Sun, June 11, 1909, page 13. Read by John Greenman. His eyes twinkling, the inevitable long cigar clenched between his teeth, and with a springy step that belied his 73.5 years, Samuel L. Clemens, who likes to be called Mark Twain, jumped into an automobile yesterday morning in front of the Belvedere Hotel and went to see his granddaughter, Miss Frances Nunnally, of Atlanta, graduated at the commencement of St. Timothy's School at Catonsville. "I call her granddaughter," he said between puffs, "because she called me Grandpa when I met her on the Minnehaha in 1907, when I was being steamed over to King Edward's Island." Mr. Clemens made the long journey from his home in Redding, Connecticut, with Mr. Albert Bigelow Paine, a biographer and novelist and close friend of the great humorist, just to hand Miss Nunneley her diploma and incidentally tell the other 5 graduates some things they should avoid in after life. He arrived in town Wednesday afternoon, took a shave, a light lunch, and went to bed. But he was up early to be ready for the trip to granddaughter's school. On the trip to the school he was accompanied by Mrs. James H. Nunneley, mother of the author's grandchild, and Mr. Paine, whom he has designated to write his biography when he dies. "But Mr. Paine will have a long wait," he said to a friend who was talking of the biography. "I'm going to fool him worse than he thinks." During the trip down Charles Street the venerable humorist made serious remarks about the Baltimore girls. He sat comfortably back in his seat, gazed with undenied admiration at the passing girls and women, and declared that they are as pretty as ever. "Pretty girls! And you almost have a monopoly of them here. Are always an inspiration to me." He smiled through his gold-rimmed glasses. "The Baltimore type still upholds the reputation the city has, and it's a fine reputation to have." When Mr. Clemens reached St. Timothy's School, the animated gathering of prettily gowned young ladies, 6 academically robed graduates, and a host of friends and relatives of the students bade him a warm welcome. When he stepped from the big touring car in his white flannels, big Panama hat, cigar, and smile, he sought his little granddaughter. Miss Nunneley was there to receive him. The pretty young graduate, with cheeks tinted like the pink roses she carried, hurried out to greet Grandpa Twain. She was the little Southern girl the humorist took such a fancy to on his recent trip to England, when he received the degree of Doctor of Literature from Oxford University. Surrounded by the graduates and friends, Mr. Clemens walked into the assembly hall of the school, took a seat on the stage in a corner, and listened to the singing of the girls. When Mr. Edward S. Martin of New York, an essayist whose daughter, Miss Lois Martin, was among the graduates, gave a talk to the young women on what they should do in later life, the humorist paid rapt attention. "I don't know what to tell you girls to do," said Mr. Clemens, rubbing his hand through his thick gray silvery hair. "Mr. Martin has told you everything you ought to do, and now I must give you some don'ts. There are 3 things that come to my mind which I consider excellent advice. First, girls, don't smoke to excess. I am 73½ years old, and have been smoking 73 of them, but I never smoke to excess. That is, I smoke in moderation, only 1 cigar at a time. Also, never drink to excess." The third admonition, "Don't marry to excess," created much amusement among the newly qualified alumni, the students, and the audience. Turning from don'ts, Mr. Clemens began a more serious discourse on honesty. He told a story from his own experience which he said proved that it was just as cheap to be honest as otherwise. While he related the anecdote in his inimitable witty manner, the students did not fail to appreciate his serious import, although everyone enjoyed a huge laugh over the then struggling writer's mishap. After his talk, Mr. Mark Twain, as he is accustomed to being addressed, gave the diplomas to the graduates, the presentations being accompanied by a hand-clap and a few cheering words of advice and congratulations. The exercises concluded with singing by the girls. When Mr. Clemens appeared on the lawn, the sun came out and said good day to him, and immediately the humorist was the center of a group of kodaking girls. With good grace he posed for them, and then he and his granddaughter had their picture taken. Miss Nunneley stood with her big bouquet of roses and academic caps and gown, while Grandpa Sam removed his cigar from his mouth and looked mischievously at the photographer. While on his way to an adjoining building where luncheon was served, a heavily built, ruddy-checked man, appearing to be 65 years old, approached him and said, "Mr. Clemens, here's a young man who wants to meet you."
"Where is he?" said Mark.
"Why, you're shaking hands with him now," said the man, who was Mr. Elias Livesey of Catonsville. "I just celebrated my 90th birthday a few days ago, and want to meet another young man like myself."
"We're well met," said the humorist, smiling, as they walked off to the dining-room together. End of interview number 252, read by John Greenman. This is section 253 of Mark Twain, The Complete Interviews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview number 253, Twain Pokes Fun at Union Station and Pities City. Baltimore Star, June 11, 1909, Section 1, page 12. Read by John Greenman. When Mr. Samuel L. Clemens, better known as Mark Twain, America's foremost living author, is left in the seclusion of his room in his palatial New York home tonight, he is going to pray that the people of Baltimore may soon procure a Union Station really worthy of the name. He said he would. Mr. Clemens shook the city's mud from his feet this morning, caught a 10:40 o'clock train for New York over the Pennsylvania Railroad, and is scheduled to arrive there this afternoon. He was accompanied by Mr. Albert Bigelow Paine, the man who has been engaged to write his biography. The poor accommodations at Union Station caused the humorist to depart from Baltimore in a sorrowing mood. Had he not seen the station, he declared, humorously of course, there would have been no occasion for prayer, and he could have trusted Baltimoreans to take care of themselves. But now that he has seen with his own eyes the small, inadequate building used as a station by the Pennsylvania Railroad to accommodate the great Baltimore public, he just felt that it would be the basest ingratitude on his part not to intercede on their behalf. "Poor Baltimore, poor Baltimore," remarked Dr. Clemens sympathetically, as he strolled by one of the small gates at the station and witnessed 100 persons struggling to get to their proper trains. "It's too bad that she hasn't a better station. Why don't the people say something? Why don't they speak their minds? Yes, it's too bad. And this for Baltimore." The humorist was numbered among the 100 persons, more or less, who attempted to jam through the gate to the New York express train. He finally did get through by making a center rush, which verified the fact that he once played football in the old college days. When he managed to wriggle his way through the gate, he knocked the ashes from the black cigar he was smoking and took one deep breath for relief. "My, but that was a squeeze," he remarked to Mr. Paine. "This city deserves something better. How does Baltimore stand it? Possibly she isn't, but remains sitting holding her hands. She should arise and do some kicking. And look at the tracks," he said sarcastically. "Every chance of getting hurt. But then I suppose all the passengers or prospective passengers have their lives insured. But that's no way to send people to incoming and outgoing trains. Why don't they let the passengers climb over the roof and slide down poles to the track on which their train is standing? Now, that is rather an odd way, but to me it is less dangerous. A slide is easier than a run, and especially when
The latter is attended with the danger of being hit by a locomotive while running." "Ah, but wouldn't it be better," exclaimed Dr. Clemens, growing serious, "if the Pennsylvania Railroad would construct stairs leading down to the trains? That would remove all danger. Yes, why don't they give Baltimore a better station? Other cities have much better stations. Why not Baltimore?" Dr. Clemens was a busy man prior to his departure. He was one of the first to arise at the Hotel Belvedere, and up to the time he was ushered into his cab which conveyed him to the station, hadn't a minute to spare. The first thing he did when he awoke was to look out the window to see if it was raining. Much to his surprise, he discovered that it was not, and that a few streaks of mellow sunshine were attempting to stream through the window of his room. "That sunshine was a surprise to me," he remarked, as he came down on the elevator and walked leisurely about the hotel lobby, puffing away at a cigar. "I thought it did nothing but rain in Baltimore. I did not know that Baltimore ever saw the sunshine. And I wonder," he continued, while a smile broke over his countenance, "if my visit is responsible for this rain. While I was in Sydney, Australia, there hadn't been any rain for 6 weeks, and the Christian people began praying for rain. They prayed night and day, and finally, one day, after supplications had been offered for about a month, a shower came up which lasted for about 2 hours. Now take me, for instance, one who is referred to as an infidel. I came here to Baltimore and produce more rain than those Christian people in Australia could in weeks of fervent prayer. Funny, isn't it?" After finishing his cigar the humorist was escorted to the dining-room, where he breakfasted with Mrs. James Nunneley and her daughter, Miss Nunneley, the latter being the young woman responsible for Dr. Clemens' visit to Baltimore. From the dining-room he returned to his room, and later departed for the station. At Union Station Dr. Clemens was the center of attraction, although he endeavored to keep out of public gaze as much as possible. With Dr. Payne keeping close by, the humorist sought the rear platform and promenaded up and down it until train time. Dr. Payne saw that every fancy was gratified. Turning around, Dr. Clemens happened to see the scales standing by. "I want to weigh," he said, "to see how well Baltimore has been feeding me." Stepping upon the scales, Dr. Payne dropped a penny in the slot, and the indicator pointed to 150 pounds. "Well, well," Dr. Clemens exclaimed, "I have gained 1 pound. They do feed well here, and I will go back home in good shape." Inside the waiting-room the humorist was approached by a bevy of pretty girls from the Carter School in Catonsville. The girls wanted to bid him farewell, and had taken an early car for Baltimore. Dr. Clemens shook each one by the hand and told them how he had enjoyed his visit. "My visit to Baltimore," he said, "has been most delightful, and I especially enjoyed the exercises at Catonsville yesterday. It was the sanest commencement I ever witnessed. I mean by that, the girls were not required to read long, tiresome essays. No, there was none of that. The exercises were splendid. Then Baltimore is such a delightful place, too," he continued, "and her people, well, we haven't their equal. The city appeals to me because of its delightful Southern atmosphere. I am a Southerner, and that is why I like to come to Baltimore. I was born in Missouri, and some of my happiest years were spent right in the South." Dr. Clemens discussed the charge of plagiarism slightly, the only important thing coming from him being the announcement that Messrs. Harper and Company were now printing an edition of the book Is Shakespeare Dead, which will give the Greenwood people credit for the excerpts taken from the book in England. "I think," he remarked, "that I have explained the situation to the satisfaction of the public, but I don't mind saying that in the future full credit will be given for all quotations from the Greenwood book. It was my intention that this should be done in the edition heretofore published." Dr. Clemens is taking a great deal of interest in the biography that is being written of himself by Dr. Payne. Every now and then he reviews what has already been written, but the author declares it will be many, many years before the public sees it. "It will be a long time," he declared, "because I am not going to die until I am at least 100 years old, or possibly older. Why, I am a boy, and Dr. Payne will have to wait several years before he can finish the closing years of my life. He has already written some of the biography, but not all, and he can't conclude his work until I am put under the ground. I am making no promises when that will be." Dr. Clemens referred lightly to his belief, he stating that it was the general impression that he did not believe in a God. All on this score, he would say, was that he believed in a great intellectual force which ruled this great universe. He emphatically stated that he did not concur in the belief of some that this big world came here by chance. Dr. Clemens is not contemplating writing any more new books just at this time. He will remain in New York for a few days, and will then go to his home at Redding, Connecticut, where he will remain all summer. End of interview number 253, read by John Greenman. This is section 254 of Mark Twain, The Complete Interviews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview number 254, Mark Twain's Smokes. Danbury, Connecticut Evening News, August 3, 1909, page 6, read by John Greenman. Mark Twain, who has been known for years as an inveterate and incessant smoker, has had to reduce his smokes to 4 a day, by the order of his physician. This is one of the means by which he is, with the aid of the physician, combating a heart trouble with which he has been afflicted for 2 months or more. He told a reporter of the News who called upon him at his country home yesterday afternoon. Danbury, as well as Redding, has now a personal interest in Dr. Samuel L. Clemens, the aged humorist of Stormfield, as his Italian villa in Redding is now known, and the people of this vicinity are gradually becoming familiar with his real name. It will be with a great deal of regret, therefore, that the people of this vicinity will learn that he is not in good health. Dr. Clemens was seen by a reporter at his home yesterday afternoon, and to him, in a half-humorous way, the famous author of humor spoke of his health and his 4 smokes a day. He was seated in the loggia of his Redding home, reading one of the late magazines and enjoying what was probably a 3rd smoke of the 4 smokes a day which he is allowed, when the reporter called and asked for a few minutes' interview. Dr. Clemens smiled a bit whimsically and extended his hand in greeting, then motioned the reporter to a chair near by. He was cordial, yet a trifle restrained in his conversation. Although he consented to talk about himself a little, he remarked in the course of the conversation that he did not like to be interviewed. He wore the immaculate white flannel suit with which the people of the entire world are familiar through the many pictures which have been made of him during the last few years.
seated in the open porch, which the cement construction of the house gave a soft gray tone, his white-clad figure, surmounted by the snow-white locks which gave him a peculiar dignity and charm of appearance, outlined against the green of the opposite hills, he was a more unique and picturesque personality than he has been made in any of the pictures which have been taken of him in the same or other surroundings. He was a trifle pale and haggard, but he was calm, and his hand was steady as he relighted the pipe which he had been smoking, and which had burned out, in the evident hope of securing from it a few more puffs of the delectable smoke. The pipe itself was unique. It was evidently a favorite pipe, for it was an old one, with the bowl partially burned away, and a generally dilapidated appearance. In speaking of his condition of health, Dr. Clemens said that he was condemned by his physicians to keep perfectly quiet, and to indulge in no more than 4 smokes a day, which to one who had been accustomed all his life to 40 smokes or more was a reduction which was about as easily accomplished as a total prohibition. "In fact, I did quit entirely for a time," said Dr. Clemens, "but the doctor said that was not necessary. The object would be accomplished just as easily with not more than 4 smokes a day, and I am not sure but there is just as much pleasure to be derived from 4 smokes as from 40, in the more complete enjoyment of the 4 and the delight of anticipating the approach of the time for one of the smokes." Dr. Clemens said that he was not able to walk 300 yards or to take a couple of extra smokes in a day without paying the penalty in a severe pain in his heart. The humorist spoke quite whimsically of the fact that he had lived almost 74 years in the belief that a man could smoke any time or all the time without any injury to his health, only to have that belief shattered at last by the condition in which he now found himself. During the conversation he made some comments upon the criticism offered upon his conduct in smoking at Oxford while waiting to receive his degree of LL.D. in violation of the rules of the institution, criticisms made recently by Dr. James L. Tracy in American Medicine, referring to Mark Twain's description of the incident in his Autobiography. He did not seem to be disturbed by the criticisms, but he explained the incident a bit in detail. "I was not responsible for that incident," he said. "There were several of us who were there for the degree of letters, and some for science degrees, who had to wait a long time for the ceremonies in which we were interested, perhaps an hour. As we stood around there was a group of 4 of us, of which I was one. I asked if smoking was allowed, and Mr. Kipling said that it was forbidden. Then some one of the 4 said that we could go around to a certain corridor, and no one would see us, and there would be nothing said. We went down there, and no one said anything, and no one came near us except some photographers. I was not the chief criminal. There were 4, 1 American and 3 Englishmen. So you see that the crime was pretty well divided up." Dr. Clemens said that he did not mind what was said about him. He was quite accustomed to it. End of interview number 254, read by John Greenman. This is section 255 of Mark Twain, The Complete Interviews. This last section contains interviews number 255 through 258, his last interview. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview number 255, Miss Clemens, Weds, New York Tribune, October 7, 1909, page 7. Read by John Greenman.
Mr. Clemens prepared the following characteristic interview to avoid any delays at the ceremony, as he expressed it. Speaking of the bride and bridegroom, Mr. Clemens said, "Clara and Gabrilowitsch were pupils together under Leschetizky in Vienna 10 years ago. We have known him intimately ever since. It's not new, the engagement. It was made and dissolved twice 6 years ago. Recovering from a perilous surgical operation, 2 or 3 months passed by him here in the house ended a week or 10 days ago in a renewal of the engagement. The wedding had to be sudden, for Gabrilowitsch's European season is ready to begin. The pair will sail a fortnight from now. The first engagements are in Germany. They have taken a house in Berlin." Speaking of the guests, Mr. Clemens said, "These guests are kinsfolk and old special friends. The Reverend Joseph H. Twichell of Hartford is a friend of mine of 42 years' standing. He married this bride's mother and me 39 years ago. Mrs. Crane, sister of Mrs. Clemens, who is present now, was present then. Mrs. John B. Stanchfield, a schoolmate of my wife, is present now. She was present then. She has grown-up children now. She was a slim young girl then, preparing for Vassar. This bride is named for her. Jervis Langdon and Mrs. Julie Loomis, nephew and niece of mine, were playmates of Clara in childhood. Dr. Quintard is present, a very old friend. Miss Ethel Newcomb, pianist, was a fellow pupil of Clara and Gabrilowitsch under Leschetizky in Vienna. Mrs. Wood is Mr. Twichell's daughter. I knew her when she had only one tooth, and preferred a nursing bottle to the Constitution of the United States. She is a mother in Israel now, but this is merely figurative. She really lives in Brooklyn. Mrs. Crane and I have been comrades 41 years, and our ages are the same. United, they foot up 148 years, though you wouldn't think it to look at us. The Gilders are old friends, though not very old in the matter of years. William Dean Howells will arrive at any time. He is 71 or 79 years old, or along there. I have known him since he was a child. Age has no age. The word has no definite meaning. Howells and I pitied James Russell Lowell when he reached 50, and Lowell pitied himself, too, not being aware that he had not yet crossed the boundary line of youth. It distressed him to have us mention the subject of age. At 50 a person is really very young, but he will not find it out until later. The marriage pleases you, Mr. Clemens? Yes, fully as much as any marriage could please me, or perhaps any other father. There are 2 or 3 tragically solemn things in this life, and a happy marriage is one of them, for the terrors of life are all to come. A funeral is a solemn office, but I go to it with a spiritual uplift, thankful that the dead friend has been set free.
That which follows is to me tragic and awful, the burial. I am glad of this marriage, and Mrs. Clemens would be glad, for she always had a warm affection for Gabrilowitsch, but all the same it is a tragedy, since it is a happy marriage with its future before it, loaded to the Plimsoll line with uncertainties. End of interview number 255, read by John Greenman. Interview 256, Mark Twain, Feeling Blue. New York Sun, December 21, 1909, page 5, read by John Greenman. Mark Twain, who has been a month in Bermuda, where he celebrated his 74th birthday on November 30th, returned yesterday by the Quebec Line steamship Bermudian, somewhat out of sorts physically and even disinclined to jest. He was amiably sad, and his familiar drawl lacked the humorous note. He said he did not like the transition from the pleasant temperature and green fields of Bermuda to the chill atmosphere of New York. He put his hand on his left breast, indicating that his trouble seemed to be chiefly there and attributed to indigestion. He was accompanied by Albert Bigelow Paine, who is assisting him with his autobiography. "I have spent most of my time in Bermuda riding," said Mr. Clemens. "I am getting too old to play golf and tennis, and I have not the inclination to do much work. When I got down to Bermuda, that pain in the breast left me. Now, on my return, I have got it back again. I have 5 or 6 unfinished tasks, including my autobiography, and I do not know when I will finish them. I have done almost nothing in the last 3 years. I may take up my autobiography again in a few weeks. I have already published 100,000 words, and expect to have 500,000 published, most after I am dead." In regard to the challenge of Major Charles Gaunter of St. Louis to play with him and Matthias Doherty the continuation of a game of euchre they had played when all three, the last surviving members of the St. Louis Euchre Club, sat up all night at St. Louis, away back in 1867, the humorist said, "I read that challenge in a dispatch from St. Louis. I am not going to continue the game. I am not well enough, and I have not time." He had this to say about women's suffrage: "I not only advocate it now, but have advocated it earnestly for the last 50 years. As to the militant suffragettes, I have noted that many women believe in the militant methods. You might advocate one way of securing rights, and I might advocate another, and they both might help to bring about the result desired. To win freedom always involves hard fighting. I believe in the women doing what they deem necessary to secure their rights." Mr. Clemens said he had been invited to lecture on women's suffrage by women's organizations. They knew where he stood on the matter. "I cannot oblige them," he said, putting his hand over his left breast. "I am troubled too much here. I would not have the strength to deliver a lecture. I won't lecture any more. My work is over in this life and this world." It was not with his usual firmness of step that the humorist came down the gangplank. Among those who met him at the pier was Mr. Martin W. Littleton and his daughter. He will spend the holidays at his home in Redding, Connecticut. End of interview number 256, read by John Greenman.
Interview number 257. Mark Twain hastily returns to Bermuda. New York World, January 6, 1910, page 2. Read by John Greenman. Mark Twain sailed again unexpectedly for Bermuda on the Bermudian yesterday for a 4-week stay. His name was not on the passenger list. On December 20, the humorist returned from Bermuda to celebrate Christmas with his daughter, Miss Jean Clemens, at his home in Redding, Connecticut. While preparing for the Christmas festivities, Miss Clemens, who was subject to fainting spells, suddenly met her death, having been found on Christmas Eve drowned in her bath. It had not been Mark Twain's intention to go back to Bermuda before April, when his daughter was to have sailed with him. The pain in his left chest, he said yesterday, was still annoying, and he thought Bermuda was the best place for him. "It is a digestive pain," said he, "and does not alarm me at all. Naturally, I am not pessimistic. I certainly was not feeling pessimistic then, for I was returning to spend what I anticipated as a very merry Christmas. I had small idea of the blow which was soon to come. This is my only companion and solace," he added, holding up a long black cigar. "It is about all I care for now, and I have been warned about making it too constant a companion. I detest the idea of shaking him, though, for he and myself have been companions such a long time." End of interview number 257, read by John Greenman. Interview number 258, the last interview. Mildred Champagne, Mark Twain at Bermuda, Human Life 11, May 1910, pages 15 and 16. Read by John Greenman. Far from the madding crowd, the world forgetting, perhaps, but by the world forgot, never. In a low, rambling, white stone house over 200 years old, nestling in a semi-tropical garden, on a point of land jutting out into the sea, lives Mark Twain in strict retirement. The house is reached from the main road by a long avenue of cedars. They extend to the thick hedge of oleanders that encircle the house and garden, hiding both from view of the casual passer-by or the solitary stroller that comes upon this sylvan retreat. At the hotel where Mark Twain had been stopping before his recent bereavement, I was told in a cautious whisper, with many side glances lest someone might overhear, of his present abode, for the secret is zealously guarded from the host of curious visitors who, upon setting foot upon Bermuda soil, eagerly inquire, "Where is Mark Twain stopping?" So it was with fear and trepidation that one bright, sunshiny morning I guided my pony down the cedar-lined path. The thick, overhanging branches made an archway that was almost somber, if it weren't for the stray bits of dazzling sky that peeped through the branches and cast fantastic shadows on the road. But for the chirping of the scarlet songsters among the branches and the soft lapping of the sapphire sea on the coral reefs, nature's sweet stillness enveloped the scene. Not a soul was in sight when I drew rein before the oleander hedge, hitched my horse to a post, and cautiously let myself within the iron gates. Then I was somewhat startled to find the big black eyes of a pickaninny staring reproachfully at me through the bars. He had sprung up from the road somewhere. He had an abnormally large head and a small, shrunken body, clothed in remnants of a shirt and tom pantaloons. One bare foot crossed the other, and was resting upon it. He was sucking a huge sugar-cane. In fact, he was all big, black, sad, reproachful eyes, and sugar-cane. So might Huckleberry Finn have looked, but for his color. He didn't want to see anybody. He evidently regarded me as an intruder. I felt strangely uneasy, and sought to mollify him.
"Who lives in this house, sonny?" I inquired. He was silent for a while. Then he answered reluctantly, "Mr. Allen, the vice-consul." "And who else?" I persisted. "Mrs. Allen." "And who else?" Again the boy was silent. Then he said in a scarcely audible whisper, "Mr. Mark Twain." And he added eagerly, "He don't lack nobody for to come see him." I thanked the boy, passed him a couple of huge English pennies through the gate, and told him to run away and hide. In another moment he had disappeared as mysteriously as he had come, and again I was in stillness and alone. I stood in the midst of a semi-tropical garden, half natural, half cultivated. Thick masses of bamboo palms, sage-bushes and ferns everywhere, with natural arches of bougainvillea, and in the middle of the garden a clearing of velvety lawn and a tennis court. The path leading to the house was lined with beds of Easter lilies, and a luxuriance of the delicate waxen freesia, their heavy, sickly sweet fragrance scenting the air. The house was a long, low, one-story stone bungalow, with a wide veranda running around the front and side, and a whitewashed gabled roof to catch the rainwater. The rich pinkish-purple bougainvillea masses against the white stone walls, and the scarlet hibiscus and pink sage bushes cluster around the veranda, almost hiding it from view. To the right in the distance, beyond the oleander hedge, the gleaming blue sea. To the left and around the front of the house again the oleander bushes, and beyond the avenue of cedars, and over all an intensely blue, fair sky and a vast stillness. Nature at her best and loveliest. An ideal place surely for a sorrow-stricken soul to find comfort and rest. I stood on the veranda at the front door, irresolute for a moment. No one was in sight. I rapped timidly once or twice, but no one responded. I made up my mind that the family was not at home, and that, hence, the servants were off duty. Then I walked around to the side of the veranda and paused in astonishment before a glass door. Through it I peered into the room. A white iron bed stood within 3 feet of the door, and upon it, full length and face downward, lay a familiar figure in a white linen suit, with a band of black crape around his arm. A number of books were spread out before him on the bed, and he was poring into them, bearing his weight on his elbows, and resting his shaggy white head in his hands. It was Mark Twain. I knocked at the door very gently. He lifted his head, as if listening, without turning his face. I knocked again. He listened as if undecided whether to open the door or not. He turned his face slightly, and I could see his lips move, and I judged it must be a gentle benediction for the knocker. Then he turned and saw me. He rose hastily from the bed and came toward the door. A beautiful smile lit up his face, which I noticed at once was scarlet, almost livid, against its shaggy frame of silvery hair. His face looked small and pinched and ill. His frame was bent, and his walk unsteady. He opened the glass door, and with both hands extended, he gave me a joyous welcome. And to the creator of Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and all the other people who have made me and so many others glad, my heart went out in love and sympathy. For just as no human being can read Mark Twain without laughing with him, so none can see him without loving him. For Mark Twain is intensely, vividly, lovingly human. He shook my hands cordially, and said in his kindest, most joyous way, "I'm so glad to see you. How do you do? Come right in. Let me take you right through to the parlor, and then I'll call the family." "Oh, please don't call the family," I begged. "I haven't come to see the family. I've come to see you, only you." And then, oh, horrors! Instead of being, like the rest of mankind, pleased at this frank bit of flattery from a petticoat,
Mark Twain's smile faded into a look of reserve and sadness, with perhaps a shade of annoyance, and then he started to cough, a miserable, nerve-racking cough that shook the whole of his slight frame and left him nervous and trembling and a trifle irritated. He held his hand on his chest. "I don't see anybody," he said. "Nobody. Nobody. I'm not extravagantly well. I bark, bark, bark all the time. I can't talk to anybody. Now, mind you, I didn't get this cough in Bermuda. Somebody kindly imported it for me from the United States." I expressed my sympathy. He was sweet again and mollified. "Have you seen the Crystal Cave yet?" he asked. "Or the aquarium?" I said, "No, I came to see you first." A sparkle of humor was in his keen blue eyes. "Well, you shouldn't have seen me first," he said quickly. "I run an opposition show to the Crystal Cave and the aquarium, but they're not shucks to me. I'm lots better. I give them their money's worth. But you should see them. Then you will appreciate me." I told him that I appreciated him anyway, that I considered him the best show on the island, that I should recommend him to all sightseers, and that, furthermore, I considered him a good writer, that I loved Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer as my own soul, that they could entertain and delight me and take me out of myself when no other characters in fiction could. And he replied earnestly, "They're fine books. They're to be recommended. You ought to like 'em. I like 'em. Everybody likes 'em. They're very, very fine works of fiction. I guess I ought to know." I agreed heartily. "You just recommend them," he continued eagerly, "but don't recommend me to sightseers. I'm too old a bird to be caught. Besides, I'm going to charge an admission fee. It's $1 a look." He coughed again, that terrible racking cough that left him weak and gasping after each onslaught. "The price is going up, up all the time," he continued weakly. "Tomorrow it will be 2 shillings, the next day 3." He raised his head and squared his shoulders. There was a far-away look in his eye. I felt a lump in my throat, and my heart ached. He took my hand again and smiled into my face. "What has impressed you most on the island, besides myself?" he asked jocosely. I answered with a will, "A certain Englishman who said to me, 'George, George,' yes, that was it, my word, yes, George, let me see, what was the chap's last name? Washington, was it not? Yes, I believe it was Washington, or something. By the way, who was this, George Washington?" Mark Twain laughed and seemed to enjoy himself. "Mr. Clemens," I said, "will you see Professor Blank, who has been in Bermuda 3 weeks now, and has made about 30 unsuccessful attempts to see you, and will go away a broken and disappointed man if he doesn't see you. He tells me pathetically that his wife and your sister have been intimate friends, and that he taught your sister's children, and so he thinks you ought to see him." "But I won't," cried Mark Twain wrathfully. "My sister has 1,000,000 intimate friends, and my sister's children had 1,000,000 teachers, and I won't see any of them. I can't see any of them he reiterated, between fits of coughing. Just then Mrs. Allen, wife of the vice consul, rushed in upon us. Mark Twain is her especial care. She looked anxiously at us. His smile reassured her, and we were introduced. "I'm very glad I saw you," said Mark Twain, shaking my hands cordially. "I'll leave you now to Mrs. Allen. Good-bye. Good-bye. Remember, the Englishman was selling you. Good-bye." He kissed his hands to me repeatedly, and then receded within his own chamber and softly closed the door, leaving us in the parlor. Again and again I heard him cough, as Mrs. Allen chatted pleasantly about the various points of interest on the island, and about their own house, which she assured me was over 200 years old. But all I heard was that pitiful cough in the next room, and all I saw was that dear, familiar old face in its shaggy frame of silvery hair. Mark Twain has experienced many a heart-rending sorrow, but it is said the loss he feels most keenly is that of his friend Henry H. Rogers, who spent so much of his time in Bermuda with him. A good story is told of their visit to the Bermuda aquarium. They stood in front of the tank containing a huge octopus, when a keeper with a big stick stirred up the tank in order to show the distinguished visitors the octopus in motion. Suddenly Mark Twain turned to Rogers and cried, "There you are, H. The big stick is after you, even down here." I saw Mark Twain again before I left Bermuda. His face was paler than when I had first seen him, and he was more composed. I inquired solicitously after his health, and he thanked me. "I am much better," he replied. "I suppose I am as well as could be expected of a man of my age and circumstances. Fairly well, but not extravagantly well, you understand. Not extravagantly well." He smiled sadly and waved his hand to me as I left him. End of interview number 258, and end of Mark Twain, The Complete Interviews. Read by John Greenman.